Okay, our next speaker is Yana Yakushina from the University of Ghent.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Yana Yakushina. I'm a lawyer and a researcher. Currently, I'm working on my PhD on legal recognition of light pollution as an environmental problem. But beyond that, I work with different international organizations like IAUS. It's a great pleasure to be presenting today, and I will be discussing intermediate results of national analysis team. Before we'll start my talk, I have a little bit of explanation of the context, what national analysis is doing. Within the national analysis team, we are looking into existing written documents, policy, and legal instruments which can be applied to protection dark and white skies in the different national states. Beyond that, we are looking into initiatives which can potentially lead to the adoption of policy and legislation. And I also want to indicate some things about the terminology and the context which I'm going to talk about. So as Aaron mentioned, he's talking about astronomical observations. I will talk also about astronomy because it's more applicable to the national context. And instead of using exploration of outer space, sometimes I will use the term space activities because it's also more applicable to the national context. So first I'm going to go through what are we doing in the national team, and then I will present the intermediate results. So as was mentioned earlier, our national analysis team is a part of work group 2 of the Policy Hub of IAUS. Our group consists of 13 contributing members, which cover more than 10 languages, and it allows us to analyze different legislation and policy across different states. And I think this will help us to see the state of art basically across the globe. Now I want to talk about how is our research structured. So we have different stages of the national analysis because, as you may think, it's pretty complicated work. This is why it was divided in 3 main stages. The first stage consists of identification and defining the general framework for protection dark and white skies in the different national states. So we are looking into protection of obstacle observations and radio astronomy as well. At the second stage, we will go beyond this general framework and look more into satellite licensing, registration, and authorization, and also the impact assessment. So we will also look whether national states has any environmental considerations when they're launching satellites. And at the final stage, the third stage, we will obviously present our final conclusions and recommendations. So we're currently almost done with our first stage. However, we looked mainly, I will be presenting today mainly the protection of dark skies, and the white skies will work after La Palma conference. It's important to note that we started in the end of June. So the next question, which is related to the research, is actually which states we have taken for the national analysis. The easiest way for us was to look into COPIUS members. We have 102 states, member states currently at the COPIUS. But we also looked beyond that, which I think will help to present a bigger picture of the protection dark and white skies. Here in the slide you can see the countries marked in green is the countries which we finished the first stage analysis. Then you have countries in orange which are in process. And then you have also countries in yellow, which we haven't started yet. In total, I mentioned earlier, we started in the end of June. We analyzed 67 states out of 102 states of the COPIUS members, and 70 countries of total 195. So I think it's a pretty big work we have already done by beginning of October. As Aaron mentioned earlier, our research is also structured based on different questions. I will go through the stages which I mentioned earlier. In every stage, we go through the specific questions which will allow us to build this framework and understanding and help the states address the issue of protection of dark and quiet skies. At the first stage, we mainly look whether is astronomy or astronomical observations. I consider it as a space activity from the national perspective. The next question, which goes after it, is, are astronomical observations actually protected within the national legislation? Because we know some examples, and yesterday the law of the sky, Spanish law, was mentioned, which is a good example of it. Then we go to whether a country has light pollution laws, because in the last 3 years we can see a growing trend of adoption of the legislation for protection of the dark sky, for example, for the environment or human health. And then we look into whether there are any other regulations, policies, which can be applied to the issue of the protection of the dark skies at the national level. At the second stage, as I mentioned earlier, we will go beyond, and we will try our best to answer the questions related to satellites. So we will look what are the regulations on registration, authorization, and licensing of the satellites, and we also will look into impact assessment, and maybe some other related questions we will come up with. So now I'm going to the most exciting part of it. What are the intermediate results which we can already present based on the national analysis? I will go through the question which I mentioned earlier, so the one which is from the first stage, but we have some additional questions which allow us to see the broader picture. The first question is, do countries recognize astronomy as a space activity? And here you have, like, two main conclusions can be mentioned. The first is national states do not per se mention astronomy as a space activity, but it's not excluded from the definition. So here in our research, we looked at the main law, like main national space law, and the definition of the space activity. And according to mostly all the countries have a definition which not limited the application of the space activity to astronomical observations and astronomy. Here you can see the example of law on space activities of the Russian Federation. Basically, Russian Federation defines space activity as a peaceful use and exploration of outer space, and then gives the list of the activities, including the observation of objects and phenomena in outer space, which, in our opinion, includes also ground-based observations. On the other hand, some countries actually consider astronomy as a space activity, but within a certain context. Basically for facilitation of terrestrial purposes. So they mention astronomy and the policy and the legislation when we're talking about the use of astronomy for example, state security, environmental monitoring. I have an example here in the slide. It's pretty big, but I will summarize it. Recently, Chile adopted the science policy, and in this policy, they're aiming to basically mentioning the protection of astronomy and the need of astronomical observations for clarifying and analyzing the data which we can obtain from the outer space. The next question, which is related to the previous one, is recognizing astronomical observations as a legal space activity is necessary for protection of dark and quiet skies. And I may admit that it's a pretty difficult question, and we're having a long discussion within actually intersection, not only in the national analysis, but also within the international analysis group. And currently, I may say that we should aim it as a main goal, but we're here talking about law and policy, and it will take a lot of time to adopt the legislation, especially international legislation. So we agree that the existing legislation can be already applied for the protection of dark and quiet skies, and I will elaborate on it a bit later. So the next question is, are there any specific national norms to protect astronomical observations, and are there laws on protection of dark and quiet skies in general? And here countries choose different approaches. Some countries have specific legislation to protect astronomy or astronomical observations. As I mentioned earlier, law of the sky of Canary Islands, so the Spanish legislation. You also have Russian legislation. But if you see generally, most of the states don't have the national law to protect the observatories, but they have the local legislation. like, for example, legislation of the city or municipality where the observation is located. And this legislation consists of the norms related to creation of dark and white zone, for example, and also the direction of luminaires, for example. The second approach, during the last 5 years, we can see the growing trends of adoption legislation on light pollution. These trends are related to energy efficiency, protection of the environment, and space sustainability. Okay. The examples of the legislation of light pollution is Croatia, Spain, Czech Republic, Chile, and Oman. And also, it has also different norms related to light pollution. And our main point is that even though the light pollution legislation is not specifically aiming to protect astronomical observations, it still can be used for it. Like, the main aim of that legislation is to protect protection of the environment, but we still create dark skies, which is already can be used for astronomical observations. Then, what other, can we talk about the model framework? Here is pretty easy. The answer is no, because the legislation just has been adopted. It is in very, very different fields, and we cannot talk about implementation yet because we even haven't done any artificial light at night measurements and monitoring aspects. Then, so our main question, if the country doesn't have any legislation to protect the astronomy, or it doesn't have any light pollution law, which other legislation can we use to address the issue of dark and white skies? And here, the main legislation which we can talk about is obviously environmental law, but Juliana elaborated on it already. We can use the general environmental law principles. We can recognize light pollution as environmental pollutant within the environmental legislation and apply the legislation for the issue. Then we have space law, which can be used at the national level. Some countries include certain environmental measurements already in the space sustainability policies, and we can here talk about the possible involvement of the protection of dark and white skies within the space law. And of course, there are other fields which can be applied. We can talk about the protection of cultural heritage. Some observatories of the universal value are protected under, they're included in the UNESCO list, so they're already protected at the national level under cultural heritage. And we also can talk about urban planning and building laws, for example, which are talking about the lighting installations. The next question related to environmental perspective is light pollution a form of pollutant under the environmental law? I will answer it as sometimes. It's either way. We can talk about the interpretation. Every country has a basic environmental law which has a definition of environmental pollutant. And they mention in most cases that energy can be also a pollutant. And when we talk about lighting, lighting is an energy. So through the interpretation, we can apply these norms already. And in some countries, light pollution is a recognized pollutant, or lighting is a recognized pollutant. And the last but not the least important question is, do countries have initiatives to protect dark and white skies? And we should admit that 99 states, of which we have analyzed, has a growing number of initiatives to protect dark and white skies. And these initiatives can potentially lead to the changes of the policy and the legislation. I would like to thank our team who is involved in this absolutely great job. And thank you for your attention.
We have a question online, I believe.
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment that applies to your presentation, also to the previous one. In the final report of the COPUOS meeting last year, so 2022, there is a statement that says they recognize astronomy in general, not just space astronomy, as instrumental to all space activities, and therefore is the discussion about protection of astronomy in COPUOS is within the remit of COPUOS itself. That doesn't mean much, because then in COPUOS this year, it was impossible to get consensus just on the name of the agenda item that was plan to discuss exactly this matter. But anyway, I think it's an important point because that report has been approved by all the delegations.
We have one very quick question over here.
Question from Robert Massey online. Is your ongoing analysis online? A directory by country could be very useful.
Can you please repeat the question, the last part of it?
Is your ongoing analysis online? A directory by country could be very useful.
Can the ongoing analysis useful for a specific country? This is the
Or,
question.
sorry, is the...
Yeah, can I just have
sorry.
A directory by country?
I guess, is the analysis online?
No, it's currently, I think it's not public yet. Yeah, it's not public yet. We hope that it will be public by the end of the year, and I hope it will be useful for different initiatives to talk with their local or national governments on the issue. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Yana.